Soft drink giant Coca-Cola is struggling as soda sales decline. With American consumers becoming more health conscious, demand for sugary carbonated drinks is falling, forcing the company to look for alternatives.
Your headline about your health tonight with a question mark for anyone who drinks sodas with that caramel color, a chemical that in some cases has been linked to cancer in mice. A new report with a warning tonight, and ABC's chief medical editor, Dr. Richard Besser, is here.
So if you drink pop or soda, there are two new studies that show how it could be hurting your health. The first comes from researchers in Quebec who say drinking just 2 cans of pop per week is too much even if you exercise.
Something just happened that no one saw coming, a decision so bold, so unexpected, that it sent shockwaves through Washington, Atlanta, and Silicon Valley all at once. Africa, the world's fastest-growing consumer market, just banned 6 major U.S. soda brands, and America is furious. But here's the twist: this isn't just about sugar or soda, this is about control. Control over markets, control over taste, control over health, policy, and the African body itself. And for the first time, Africa said no. For decades, American soda giants have dominated Africa's shelves. From Coca-Cola to Pepsi, Fanta to Sprite, these fizzy symbols of the West became part of daily life. They sponsored our football teams, our schools, our concerts. They branded our youth culture, but beneath the pop and fizz, a storm was brewing quietly, dangerously, and for years, doctors warned of rising diabetes rates, environmentalists raised alarms about plastic pollution, and local farmers watched helplessly as U.S. corporations imported corn syrup, sugar, and flavoring chemicals instead of buying from African producers. Then came the final spark. In early 2025, independent lab reports surfaced in Kenya, Nigeria, and Ghana showing alarming levels of banned artificial sweeteners and colorants in several imported U.S. sodas. One chemical, brominated vegetable oil used in flame retardants, was found in popular American brands. Another, aspartame, already under global review for potential health risks, exceeded local limits. Health ministries acted fast, but when African regulators demanded explanations, U.S. companies brushed them off, claiming production differences and logistical variances. That's when Africa snapped. Within 48 hours, 6 major American soda brands were banned in over a dozen African countries pending full safety investigations. AU officials called it a continental health sovereignty decision. For the first time, African nations coordinated to regulate what enters their markets on a shared scientific standard, not based on U.S. or European guidelines, but African ones. And suddenly, the unthinkable happened. American lobbyists panicked. The ban triggered billions in losses, stocks dipped. Coca-Cola Africa's PR team went silent. The U.S. State Department issued a statement calling the move economically concerning. But the deeper truth? This was never about just soda. It was about Africa drawing a red line against decades of corporate dominance. While glossy commercials painted soda as happiness, the numbers told a darker story. In just 20 years, obesity and diabetes rates tripled across urban Africa. And yet these same soda companies lobbied aggressively to block sugar tax laws in Nigeria, Kenya, and South Africa. They spent millions funding youth lifestyle campaigns not to promote health but to secure lifelong consumers. So when African labs exposed what these sodas contained, chemicals banned even in parts of Europe, it became a symbol of how Western corporations viewed Africa, not as partners but as testing grounds. In an emergency meeting in Addis Ababa, several African health ministers called the discovery a health emergency disguised as business. The AU quickly formed a food and beverage safety task force with plans to create Africa's own FDA-style watchdog. This move, though underreported in Western media, represents a massive shift in global trade dynamics. Because if Africa can ban U.S. sodas, it can ban anything from gamos to pharmaceuticals if they violate its standards. That's not just regulation, that's independence. Meanwhile, in the U.S., networks went into overdrive. Some analysts called it a coordinated anti-American campaign. Others blamed China and the BRICS alliance, suggesting Beijing influenced the ban to weaken U.S. brands in Africa. But behind closed doors, American trade officials knew the truth. This was years in the making. U.S. corporations had ignored African scientists, activists, and lawmakers for too long, and now, the continent had found its voice. Dr. Amina Yusuf, one of the researchers who exposed the soda contamination, said it best: "For decades, we've imported not just products but diseases. This is not a boycott of America, it's a declaration of health freedom." Her words went viral, viewed millions of times across TikTok, X, and YouTube. Youth-led movements began calling for a Drink African campaign, urging people to support local juice brands and natural drinks made from hibiscus, baobab, and ginger. Because behind the public outrage, a powerful lobbying battle has already begun. American corporations are pressuring African governments to reverse the bans, threatening to pull out investments, jobs, and sponsorships. And while Africa stands firm, not every leader is on the same side. Some countries are buckling under diplomatic pressure, others are doubling down, forming trade pacts to promote African-made beverages regionally. The next chapter in this saga could redefine Africa's entire trade relationship with the United States. What began as a simple health scandal has become a continental awakening, a movement that says Africa will no longer consume what others won't, and in a world where every sip carries a political message, this might be the boldest stand Africa has ever taken. When the ban hit, it wasn't a slow burn, it was a shockwave. Across African ports, customs officials began seizing entire shipments of US-made soft drinks, 6 major brands, 6 global empires, all under investigation. The affected names read like a who's who of America's beverage dominance: Coca-Cola Classic, PepsiCo's Mountain Dew, Dr Pepper, Fanta Orange US formulation, 7-Up US export batch, Gatorade Frost series. These weren't random. They represented America's flagship beverage arsenal, and their removal from African markets meant billions lost in trade value. The African Union's official statement was simple but historic: until safety reassurances and ingredient transparency are met, all imports from the listed U.S. beverage companies are hereby suspended. But behind the diplomatic wording lay a deeper truth. Africa wasn't just questioning soda, it was questioning America's food ethics. For decades, the U.S. exported different formulations to different continents. Weaker health regulations abroad meant cheaper ingredients, higher sugar content, and banned additives could slip through. Africa, long treated as a second-tier market, finally said enough. Inside corporate America, panic spread. Coca-Cola's regional headquarters in Atlanta scrambled to issue statements. PepsiCo lawyers launched emergency calls to their African distributors. Lobbyists began dialing Washington, pleading for diplomatic intervention. But the real fear? That the ban would set a precedent, one that could ripple across Asia, Latin America, and the Middle East. If Africa could unite and stand up to U.S. soda giants, what's stopping other regions from doing the same? This wasn't just about fizzy drinks anymore, it was about a global rebellion against Western food dominance. For decades, the United States used its agricultural and beverage industries as soft power weapons, infiltrating cultures through brands, taste, and lifestyle. From Hollywood movies to Coca-Cola ads, American identity was marketed as cool, modern, and global. Now that illusion was breaking and Africa was leading the charge. What we're witnessing, said Dr. Tun Dalakan, economist at the University of Lagos, is Africa's trade independence in real time. This isn't anti-American sentiment, it's economic justice. For years we've consumed their goods, but they've ignored our health, our environment, and our industries. His words echoed across the continent, because for once the Global South wasn't asking for permission, it was making the rules. Coca-Cola factories in Africa employ thousands, but the profits rarely stay local. Every year, millions in revenue are repatriated to the U.S., while local farmers struggle to sell their sugarcane, cassava, and fruit to foreign-owned bottlers. The soda ban sparked a new debate: should Africa continue to rely on imported formulations, or start producing its own, healthier, homegrown beverages? And just like that, a new movement was born: Drink Local, Build Africa. TikTok creators began showcasing African-made drinks, from hibiscus zobo in Nigeria to baobab juice in Senegal and sorghum-based beverages in Ethiopia. Sales for local brands spiked by 300% in just 2 weeks. In Ghana, a startup called AfricVibe went viral after releasing a soda made from natural kola nut extract, no artificial sweeteners, no imported sugar, and packaged in eco-friendly glass bottles. Within days, orders flooded in from across the continent. The message was clear: Africa wasn't just banning U.S. sodas, it was reclaiming the market. But America wasn't going to take that quietly. Behind closed doors, U.S. trade officials began drafting countermeasures. Washington warned that the soda ban could strain relations with African trade blocs. Several African ambassadors in D.C. were quietly approached. Some offered new investment deals to reconsider the ban, and soon major Western media outlets started running familiar headlines: is Africa falling under Chinese influence? Bricks behind anti-American trade policies? The playbook was obvious: shift the narrative, make Africa look like a puppet, not a policymaker. But this time it didn't work. For once, Africa's message was unified. This was not Beijing's idea, this was not Moscow's manipulation. This was African sovereignty written in bold ink. At a press conference in Addis Ababa, AU Commissioner for Trade and Industry, Nosazana Mwenda, declared, if a product doesn't meet African health standards, it doesn't enter Africa. We will no longer drink the leftovers of Western deregulation. Those words were historic. In that single sentence, Africa redrew the trade boundaries of the 21st century. By the third week of the ban, U.S. beverage exports to Africa dropped by 68%. major African distributors began switching to regional suppliers, and American corporations faced nightmare brand erosion. For years, they spent billions building emotional loyalty. Now, overnight, that trust was gone. Videos flooded social media of people dumping U.S. sodas into the streets, calling them toxic colonizers. The optics were brutal. America's soft power literally poured down the drain, but the question remains, why did it take this long? Why did Africa have to reach a breaking point before acting? The answer lies deep within trade dependency. For years, African nations relied on U.S. aid, loans, and corporate partnerships that came with invisible strings. Regulatory independence was a myth. Health ministries often lacked the funding or authority to challenge global giants, but that changed in 2025. The new Africa isn't just resisting, it's rebuilding. And this soda ban may just be the first domino, from a single lab test to a continental ban, from a bottle of soda to a declaration of independence. Africa has proven one thing: you can't pour exploitation into a bottle and call it refreshment. This isn't the end of the story, it's the beginning of a global reckoning, because now the world is watching. If Africa can stand up to America's biggest soda giants, what or who will be next? When Africa banned 6 major U.S. sodas, Washington laughed at first. They thought it was symbolic, temporary, a bluff. But when the embargo stretched in 2 weeks, costing corporations hundreds of millions, the laughter stopped. Now it was war, not a war of soldiers, but of lobbyists, contracts, and quiet phone calls at midnight. Behind the scenes, America's soda giants Coca-Cola, PepsiCo, and Dr. Pepper Snapple Group formed an emergency coalition known internally as the Beverage Integrity Task Force. Its mission? To crush the ban, to discredit the scientists, and to pressure African governments back into compliance, whatever it took. The playbook was old but effective: money, influence, and fear. Whistleblowers inside one major soda company leaked internal memos showing millions allocated to strategic partnerships in Africa, a coded term for influencing regulatory bodies and media coverage. Leaked memo excerpt reads, "We must reframe the narrative. The African ban is politically motivated, position our brands as victims of anti-Western sentiment." It was a propaganda war disguised as public relations. Within days, certain Western media outlets began publishing opinion pieces claiming the ban was scientifically unfounded and influenced by Chinese disinformation. But there was one problem: the science wasn't wrong, the chemicals were banned elsewhere, and the data came from Africa's own labs. So if the facts couldn't be discredited, America needed another plan. That's when the lobbying machine kicked into high gear. In Washington, the U.S. Chamber of Commerce quietly issued warnings to African embassies. Their message was subtle but chilling. Trade relations could be reconsidered. In plain English, reverse the ban or lose U.S. investment. It was economic blackmail dressed as diplomacy. But Africa didn't flinch. In fact, something remarkable happened. Nations that rarely agreed on anything began unifying. Nigeria, Kenya, Ghana, Tanzania, South Africa, Senegal all reaffirmed the ban, even under U.S. pressure. Behind this newfound confidence stood an unexpected ally: BRICS. BRICS nations saw the soda ban as more than a health issue. It was an opening, a signal that Africa was finally ready to build its own trade identity outside Western dependence. In confidential briefings, Chinese and Indian officials reportedly offered testing technology, food safety expertise, and export alternatives for Africa's beverage industries. Russia offered trade incentives for natural sugar exports. India proposed investment in organic beverage processing plants. The message was subtle but strategic. You don't need Washington to define your food standards anymore, and that terrified America. Because if Africa's new trade systems aligned with BRICS regulatory frameworks, it meant the end of U.S. influence over what 1 billion Africans eat and drink. It meant the end of Western approval as the global standard. It meant independence in its purest economic form. On American soil, lobbyists doubled down. They began framing the ban as a geopolitical crisis. In one televised hearing, a senator declared, "This soda ban is not about sugar, it's about sovereignty. Africa is being pulled into the BRICS orbit and we're losing our soft power." That statement said it all. For decades, U.S. corporations had been the unofficial ambassadors of American culture. Now their influence was dissolving one bottle at a time. Meanwhile, in Africa, the movement exploded. Activists began demanding audits of all imported processed foods, not just sodas. NGOs called for African nutrition acts to protect local populations from chemical-laden imports. TikTok and X hashtags like #CleanAfricaDrinks and #BanToxic Imports went viral. Suddenly, this wasn't just a policy, it was a continental rebellion. Young Africans began to see the soda ban not as restriction but as liberation. For once, one Ghanaian student said, "We're deciding what goes into our bodies, not Washington." But make no mistake, the U.S. wasn't giving up. Behind the headlines, American corporate lawyers began exploiting trade loopholes. Instead of exporting the banned sodas directly, they routed them through third-party countries like Egypt and Morocco, relabeling them as reformulated beverages. Some shipments slipped through, others were caught. And when investigative journalists exposed the scheme, it triggered outrage and lawsuits. Several African consumer rights groups filed joint cases demanding accountability for deceptive import practices. The lawsuits named not just companies but also Western embassies accused of looking the other way. By mid-year, the soda ban had become more than a trade conflict, it was a global story about dignity and defiance. Africa was setting a new precedent, the right to regulate, reject, and reimagine. Western analysts called it the beverage rebellion, but to millions of Africans it was something simpler: freedom in a bottle. There, something historic happened. BRICS officially proposed the creation of an African Food Safety and Standards Network, AFSAN, fully funded and managed by African nations but supported by BRICS laboratories and logistics. This would mean one thing: Africa could test, certify, and regulate all imports independently from Western influence. For the US, that was a nightmare, because control over standards has always been control over trade. Once Africa had its own system, Washington's leverage would vanish overnight. What began as a ban on soda had evolved into a blueprint for independence. From oil to tech, from agriculture to medicine, if Africa could unite around food safety, it could unite around economic sovereignty. And perhaps that's why US lobbyists are now working overtime, not to protect soda profits, but to protect the system itself. A system where Africa consumes what others decide, where aid is disguised as access, where health warnings are buried under billion-dollar branding campaigns. That system is collapsing. Today, America is still pressuring African nations to reverse the soda ban, but the genie is out of the bottle. Across the continent, leaders are asking a new question: if we can stand up to big soda, can we stand up to big pharma, big tech, big agriculture? Because this was never about what's in a bottle, it's about who owns your choices. Africa's soda ban might just become the spark that redefines global trade, a reminder that true freedom isn't declared by speeches. It's defended in the decisions of what a people choose to consume. From the outside, it looked like a small story, a simple ban on 6 American soda brands, but those who understood what really happened, no, it was something far greater, because when Africa took that stand, it wasn't just rejecting a drink, it was rejecting an entire system. For decades, Africa was told what to consume, what to grow, and what to believe was safe. The world sold its sweetness and hid the poison beneath the label, but in 2025, for the first time, Africa looked back at the label and said, no more. In Washington, they called it a crisis. In London, a disruption. But in Nairobi, in Accra, in Lagos, it was called something else: freedom. Because what happened? After the soda ban wasn't chaos, it was creation. African innovators began experimenting with local ingredients. Young startups found investors through the new Pan-African Beverage Fund launched by ECOWAS, and communities rediscovered what they once had: natural, unprocessed taste. You see, this was never just about soda, it was about ownership of narrative, health, and destiny. For too long, foreign corporations turned Africa into a dumping ground for chemicals banned elsewhere, for products too dangerous for their own citizens. But when Africa banned those 6 US sodas, it did more than regulate imports, it drew a line in the sand of history. That line said, we will no longer be the world's experiment. We will no longer drink what others won't. We will decide for ourselves what our people deserve. And suddenly, the world paid attention. In France, media outlets asked if Europe should follow Africa's lead in banning US sodas with questionable chemicals. In Brazil, activists called for solidarity with Africa, citing similar struggles against corporate food monopolies. In India, parliamentarians praised Africa for standing up to Western food colonization, and even inside the United States, small cracks appeared. Health advocates began demanding transparency about what was being exported versus what was sold domestically. Africa's decision had triggered something unthinkable: a global chain reaction of accountability. In boardrooms from New York to Geneva, fear turned into realization. Africa was no longer just a consumer market, it was becoming a moral market. Because when 1 billion people demand better, the world listens. In the months that followed, the African Union finalized a new trade framework called the Continental Health and Safety Accord. It ensured that no foreign product, no matter how rich the brand, could bypass African standards again. Each nation would have its own labs, its own scientists, and its own power to protect its citizens. That was the legacy of the soda ban. The economic transformation was stunning. Local beverage industries grew by over 500%. In just 1 year, youth employment surged. And for the first time in modern history, African ingredients, not imported ones, became the foundation of a billion-dollar beverage market. What once seemed like rebellion had become rebirth. But perhaps the greatest change wasn't in factories or trade deals, it was in consciousness. The African consumer had awakened. People began reading labels, questioning ingredients, and challenging corporations. Buy African was no longer a slogan, it was a movement. From the streets of Dakar to the markets of Lusaka, young Africans proudly raised bottles of locally made drinks and shouted, "We choose us." Meanwhile, U.S. corporations struggled to rebuild their reputation. They promised new formulations, local partnerships, healthier products, but the damage was done. Trust once broken cannot be rebranded. For the first time in history, America was on the defensive in a market it once dominated, and as this new chapter unfolds, one truth stands clear: Africa has stopped being the background of someone else's story. It has become the author of its own. From rejecting unsafe sodas to rewriting trade norms, Africa is proving that sovereignty isn't a political slogan. It's a daily act of courage lived through every choice, every policy, every product we accept or reject. Imagine this generation growing up knowing that their nations chose health over profit, that their leaders stood firm against one of the most powerful industries in the world, that they said no and the world listened. That's not just history, that's empowerment, and make no mistake, the ripples are spreading. What started as a soda ban has now inspired discussions on imported pesticides, seed patents, and pharmaceuticals. The same question is being whispered in ministries and boardrooms across Africa: if we can control what we drink, can we control what we plant, what we heal with, what we build? The answer, slowly but surely, is becoming yes. This is not the Africa of dependency and silence. This is the Africa of decisions, the Africa of dignity, the Africa that knows its worth. And if that means standing against the biggest brands on earth, so be it, because the world might make soda. But Africa? Africa is making history. This is AfricVibe News, where Africa tells its story, on its own terms, to a world finally forced to listen.